Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 7 of our Natural Mental Health Online Resilience Retreat. I'm Henry Emmons.
I'm Dr. Tim Colbert.
And I'm Amy Prasek.
And I just want to introduce our special guest tonight, Jennifer Fallon, PhD. Jennifer is an integrative psychologist. She's in private practice, and she also works with us through Partners in Resilience as a facilitator for our resilience program. So tonight, we're going to extend a conversation that we've started over the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about emotions, how to deal with them, the good and the bad or the difficult. But tonight we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about really big emotions. We call those emotional storms. And I want to open this by reading a poem. This is a really beautiful and pretty well-known poem by Mary Oliver. It's called The Journey. And I think in listening to this, you'll see why I'm choosing this to talk about emotional storms. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. The only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. So I just want to repeat one of those lines. The wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations. That is no ordinary emotion, everyday emotion that she's talking about there. That's a storm. So Jennifer, you have worked with us a lot, both in your practice and also in our resilience program. Can you just say a little bit more about what we mean when we use the term emotional storms?
Sure. And it's really not an everyday experience. We don't have these just Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday throughout the week. This is a big emotional, perhaps even overwhelming experience that's tied in usually with physical sensation and also a whole storyline that stems from your past. When you think about an incident in which you felt anger all of a sudden, and you could feel that anger suddenly through your arms, perhaps you even looked down and noticed that your hands were already in fists. So you're having a very powerful reaction before you've even really processed it. That could be part of an emotional tsunami or an emotional storm. It might also be if you experience rejection and it hits you so hard that you actually feel sick to your stomach, or perhaps a fear, sense of anxiety, which many of us may be feeling these days, that hits you so intensely in a given moment that you actually find it hard to breathe. So it isn't that low-level anxiety that's kind of pervasive right now. It's really the intense, overwhelming experience of it that we're getting at today.
So I like the term emotional tsunami. It sounds like it is a powerful wave of emotion that can sweep us off our feet.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in part because it's usually tied to a sense of rejection. which is then connected to a sense of shame. And Brene Brown talks about shame as an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. And we are wired to be intimately, personally aware of any threat to our connection. So we really do get overwhelmed down to our core if we feel that we might be losing that. Rick Hansen talks about it as the lizard within us, that original reptile sense that is going to respond to any threat and responds before the more recent developments in the brain, like our prefrontal cortex, all of our fancy thinking, can intervene and help us process the experience.
That really speaks to this being a reactive thing. You know, it's almost like a reflex. Now, I want to contrast that that concept and that notion with some of the language that Pema Chodron uses to talk about the human condition, which I just have always liked, and she has such a great way of making things so accessible.
Yes.
So she talks about why so many of us fall into the trap of what she calls wild mind. And wild mind, I think, is very similar to this concept we're calling emotional storms. And she says that the reason that we're so susceptible to this is because we have been training in wild mind our entire lives. Starting as a baby, there was just a little bit of it, and it's just been getting bigger and bigger, and we've been getting better at this as we get older. But she also says that that's not the true nature of the mind. The true nature is what she calls natural mind, which she describes as being much more open and expansive. So talk a little bit about that, Jennifer, this aspect of ourselves of being more of in tune with that natural mind, and how does it feel and how can we connect to that?
Right. I think the experience of natural mind for me is easiest to connect to a sense of spaciousness. So we can experience natural mind a number of different ways, probably throughout the course of this program. People have been encountering that in mindfulness and meditation and other ways. But for me, I really like going to the analogy of the sky. And there was a quote about this actually on the website. And Pema's reference to, I think it was along the lines of, you are the sky and everything else is the weather. And so similarly, I talk to clients all the time about a big sky perspective. And if you look up at the sky, and I'll have people do this, we'll literally step outside and look up at the sky, there's so much room. There's room for clouds. There's room for a storm to come through and to pass, perhaps to leave rain. And there's also room for the sun. And sometimes you might even have clouds and sunlight at the very same time. So the capacity that we have is almost infinite. And yet we often get sucked into this tunnel vision. It comes a lot with trauma. It comes with high anxiety, intense depression, these emotional tsunamis, where all we can really connect to is how overwhelmed we feel emotionally in that particular moment. I think all of this gets back to awareness as the key word. So in an emotional tsunami, in a state of wild mind, we're acting without awareness. And what we're hoping is that we can move towards more and more awareness and more of that natural, calm, big sky perspective. I've also heard this referred to as the 40,000 foot vantage point. So that if you're a hiker, if you enjoy the mountains, you know that when you get up high and you look down, something that seemed so important is suddenly quite minor. Now, it's not totally insignificant, but it's much, much less. And I think that we can draw wisdom from that too. even when we're in the midst of a very, very difficult experience, it's not only our life and our individual experience that's happening at any given moment. There are innumerable lives. There are so many things happening in that given moment, and we don't have to be completely consumed by our own. And Thich Nhat Hanh has a reference to this that I like too. He says, if we learn to suffer well, we suffer less. And so I think that too is, yes, we are going to have difficult moments, but we don't have to perpetuate them or add fuel to the fire. One last thing I would add is when we are in meditation and mindfulness, we're actually weaving a basket. And I find this works very well with that concept of the big sky perspective. So it's as though you were weaving a basket for yourself through all these meditation, mindfulness, compassion practices, one that can hold these difficult experiences without being overwhelmed, and also does not collapse under their weight. So again, it's just like the sky, but instead you've flipped it so it can hold things for you.
So we've all been there, having one of these emotional tsunamis kind of take us over and knock us down, and perhaps and kind of reacting unconsciously, you know, automatically. I want to kind of tie this to a concept I brought in a couple of weeks ago when I talked about the second arrow, about how our reaction to something can actually cause more harm than the thing itself. So with these really big emotions where we're you know, our more conscious, aware mind is kind of shutting off for a little while, what can we look for as signs that we are about to make things worse, that we're about to do something or say something that we know is going to make things worse?
Right. Well, that's the big question, right? And if I had the answer to how we could know that all the time, I would certainly share it with you. But I can certainly speak from my own experience, having learned the hard way and still, you know, occasionally having to learn it again. When I feel compelled to say something or do something, that's a pretty big indicator that probably I don't need to do it, or at least I don't need to do it then. Because that sense of being compelled really doesn't leave any room for consideration of the other person, his or her perspective, or reflection on what the consequences of my action or comment might be. So instead, I like to try to practice the morning after reflection, or sometimes called the after the storm reflection. And that is a helpful name because it can remind you that it will take a while for that storm to pass. You're not going to just think to yourself, ooh, I don't want to do something that'll make this worse. I don't want to have that second arrow launch and then be able to go right into problem solving mode. You really have to disengage. You have to give your system a chance to reset. Probably you're going to want to practice some of the grounding exercises that we'll talk about later. And you might even want to evaluate a little bit, try to understand, you know, what was the thought that was such a trigger? What was the storyline that got involved here? What can I learn from this situation before you jump in and try to act? Now, does that happen perfectly every single time? Of course not. And so I always say, however you responded, don't add yet another arrow by beating yourself up. Just try to practice some compassion. You can own your mistake, apologize, but it isn't going to serve anyone for you to add additional injury, even to yourself. One of the first things that I like to do to try to get out of an emotional storm is to attend to the sensation that is really that very first arrow. And that's the thing that we can't necessarily avoid, you know, and sometimes this has nothing to do with other human beings. Like my recent experience of this was a physical illness. So there wasn't anything I could have done to prevent it. There wasn't anyone else at fault, but I had this physical sensation, and it really triggered a big reaction in me, in part because we're in the midst of this COVID situation, and so becoming ill has a whole bunch of extra meaning. But I was able to see it pretty early, and it's in part because that sensation was so incredibly intense that I knew, oh, this is not a time to try to evaluate what's going on. This isn't a time to try to understand some story or figure out what the meaning is here. This is just a time to try to take care of myself and help myself feel better. So as Henry knows, I am also a trained yoga teacher. And this is one of the places where I think physical meditative practices are incredibly helpful. If you have practiced consistently or trained in one of these, you get to know your body very well. And so not only have you practiced cultivating calm, but you also learn to recognize how your body feels when you're calm and when you're not, when a powerful reaction, sometimes referred to as destructive emotions, like by the Dalai Lama, but when something like that takes over, you can feel it and pretty readily identify what's going on. It also, that close connection with your body also helps you have better, more quick access to the breath, which can be a way out. The breath can be like the off-ramp on the superhighway that would lead you deep, deep, deep into that emotional tsunami. And so you can turn to the breath. You might be able to access grounding strategies, which are usually body-based. All of that takes you away from your mind and the provocative thought and that personally relevant storyline. So that's my favorite place to try to intervene. If you miss it there, which is very common, you might catch it at the thought, which doesn't necessarily have to be problematic, but can often be because it's so tied to the storyline. But if you miss it there, you can then catch it when you get that physical sensation that's completely overwhelming, the real flooding of emotion, where you might want to cry, you might want to act out. And here, really the best thing to do is to just try to get calm and to soothe yourself. So in the same way that if you saw a child crying or you saw a puppy that was whimpering, you wouldn't focus on why they were upset. You wouldn't ask all of the logic questions. You would simply try to soothe and comfort them. And that's exactly what you can do for yourself too.
Nice. So I'm reminded as you're talking of a New Yorker cartoon I saw a few years ago, which has these two fish, just a little below the surface. They're talking to each other and there's a hook that comes hanging down right between them, and one of them is saying to the other, the secret is non-attachment. And so it's not being attached or not getting hooked by this emotion, which is so tempting to do. And I like what you're saying, because it's just not always possible for us to think our way out of something like this. And so having, something physical, something in the body, we talk about it as getting grounded. One of the things that we often recommend as just sort of a really quick and surprisingly effective tool to bring you back into your body is to use the sensation of smell and to have an aromatherapy, something that's calming or soothing. Just have it at the ready. And just sniff on that, because it immediately takes you out of your thinking brain and into a really vivid and usually very calming physical sensation. So maybe we can spend the rest of our time, just a few minutes, talking about some other ways that people can get grounded, and maybe you can guide us in an experiential around that people can take with them.
Sure. One of the easiest ways to get grounded, if you have the opportunity, is to go outside or somehow connect to the earth. Being grounded is really about being present in ourselves, but in a calm and steady way. And so the earth is really a wonderful source of that steadiness, that solidness. So there are many practices, ancient practices around literally touching the earth. And Thich Nhat Hanh has a lovely one called Touching the Earth, where you bring your body into contact with it. In yoga, there's a pose called crocodile pose, where you lay on your stomach on the floor. And you can stack your hands like this and rest your forehead on your hands. But the idea, again, is that your belly is supported by the earth. And you are reminded of the breath as you breathe in and breathe out and feel yourself touching the floor more strongly without any effort. So that's part of it. We do want a grounding practice to be pretty effortless, really not adding extra strain. A classic one that many people use with the trauma survivors is to have something you can hold in your hand. The hands can be very grounding, and you might even think of rosary beads. Maybe you had a grandmother or someone who used to pray with rosary beads. It's the same sort of process, something tangible that you can feel to bring you out of your thoughts and right back into the moment. One of the things that I've been doing, both to ground before something difficult happens, but also to align my circadian rhythm in these times where we're off schedule, is to go outside first thing in the morning. And I really try to do this all the time. It's kind of wonderful to do it in what seems like awful weather. But you go out, you start your day by connecting to what is happening in the physical world around you, feeling that fresh air, breathing it in, hearing the birds. I happen to take a warm beverage out with me, and holding a warm beverage can be another grounding activity. And then I also bring my dear dog, and really focusing on your animal, something that you have a strong connection with, and in this case, something I can pet and touch. All of those are also grounding. So there are really a lot of options, and it's best to just try to find something that goes well with what you are already drawn to. What I'm gonna recommend tonight are two short practices, very short. One is literally putting your hand on your heart, and you can put two hands here. We now know that there is a loop here that can stimulate oxytocin more quickly than in some other areas of the body. So you can just be right here. You can have your eyes open or closed as ever feels comfortable with you, and just bring to mind one moment in which you felt loved. It doesn't have to be a perfect relationship. It doesn't even have to be a real relationship. It could have been with an imaginary friend as a child, or with a pet that's passed away now. But you just bring to mind that moment of feeling loved. And already I can see smiles and my colleagues here relaxing. So it's very brief. And you can do this when you're stuck in the elevator and no one really has to know what's going on. So you don't have to have anything else with you. The other one I want to share with you is one that my son taught me. So he learned this in school, and we are really fortunate these days. Children are learning mindfulness and meditation and these ways of grounding. So you take your hand, turn your palm to look at yourself, right, to face yourself. And you can start on either end. I prefer to start over by my thumb. And you inhale up and exhale down, tracing the outline of your hand. Inhale up, exhale down. Ideally through your nose. Watching your finger, so your eyes have a steady point to focus on. And then a nice long exhale to end. Yep, super simple. And you can go back. You know, we kind of do this a couple times. Sometime I'll trace his hand. You know, it's fun and it's sweet and it's quick and light.
Lovely, thank you. That was really great. Mm-hmm. Well, we're gonna turn this back over to Dr. Colbert. Tim, you wanna talk a little bit about how kids can apply these principles?
You bet. And you know, the things that I'll talk about tonight actually apply very much to adults as well. I like this idea about building on the body response. And you know, you think about big emotions and really emotions of any kind. There's that thinking part, there's that feeling part, but oftentimes there's really an important physical part as well. And most commonly that physical part is something to do with what's called the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. So the ANS is this control system that unconsciously regulates physiologic functions like our heart rate, digestion, breathing. And it's important to think about this idea that depending on where we are at in our autonomic nervous system kind of balance point, that can actually have a big impact on how we are responding in terms of more intense emotions versus, let's say, being better able to modulate our emotions. And you probably have all heard about this, but there are two main branches to the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, which is the gas pedal, if you like the car analogy, it revs things up. And when you are stressed, of course, you kick off the sympathetic nervous system and that fight or flight response. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is like the brakes on the car, and sometimes that's called the rest and digest system. And the idea is this, that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems really work in this beautiful dynamic balance all day long. And ideally what we want is this kind of perfect balance, if you will, this optimal level of nervous system arousal, like a set point in which we are functioning really optimally. Some people have called that the window of tolerance, that zone in balance of our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems where we function really well. And as you might guess, the problem is this: for most of us, it's not that we have too much relaxation and we are always turning on the parasympathetic nervous system. That's not the deal in modern life. The problem is always, for most of us, that we are all revved up and we are cranking up our sympathetic nervous system 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And, modern life just lends itself to that. And certainly in this situation with the coronavirus, many of us notice that we have a lot of stresses and strains for a variety of reasons. So from an emotional standpoint, when we have too much sympathetic nervous system activity going on, we might feel things like tension or emotional reactivity, defensiveness, racing thoughts, emotional overwhelm, that kind of sense of hypervigilance, or obsessive or related thoughts. And physically, in the over aroused state from a sympathetic nervous system standpoint, we commonly will have sweaty, cold hands. We'll have quicker, shallower breathing, intense muscles, along with a rapid heartbeat. On the other hand, when our parasympathetic relaxation response is allowed to kick in, we tend to have drier hands, we have warmer hands, we have deeper diaphragmatic breathing, and we tend to have looser muscles. However, if we overactivate and have too much parasympathetic nervous system activity, that can be a problem as well. Emotionally, we could become disengaged, under-aroused, low energy. So I think the whole idea is here, what we want to do is, if we can day to day, is find that optimal balance, that window of tolerance for ourselves, and try to stay in that window if we can, as much as we can all day long, because then we feel and think more simultaneously. We're in a better balance. We tend not to overreact. We feel more open and curious. And I think we're better able to modulate our emotions and our behavior. And so one of the questions is, in modern life with all the stresses, realistically, how do you do that? And we certainly, hear a lot about mind-body skills, but I want to suggest that we think about some of these newer healing technologies in this situation. So what's beautiful about some of the new technologies out there, and these are things that you can purchase on, Amazon or online and get pretty inexpensively, but these technologies allow us to measure the autonomic nervous system response and then understand whether we are in balance or not in balance. And then we can learn to train that balance day to day, all day long, so that when we get in these situations where we are stressed, we tend not to overreact, and we can avoid some of those big emotions that are so difficult for us to manage. So I want to just mention two technologies that I think are particularly useful. One is for the younger kids. There's a newer technology called Mightier, M-I-G-H-T-I-E-R, and you can look at their website, mightier.com. But I think this is a really great idea. What they do is they hook kids up to a heart rate monitor while they play video games. And these video games are specially designed to cause frustration and difficulty and anger. And then when the kids find that they're getting challenged and frustrated, of course, their heart rate goes up, their sympathetic nervous system triggers, and they can feel very angry and upset. But what happens is then the game does not work as well either. So what they learn to do through a variety of breathing exercises is actually control their heart rate during these times when they're becoming frustrated. The game then plays better and rewards them, and they learn literally how to decrease their nervous system arousal and feel more in control of their emotions at the same time. And it's a beautiful combination, kind of all framed in the video gameplay, which of course is very important and very user-friendly for kids nowadays. So that's a great technology to think about. And helping kids to find that window of tolerance and really learn how to control both their emotions and their autonomic nervous system together. For adults, there's a great kind of counterpart called Inner Balance. It's a smartphone-based app, and you learn to control the heart rate variability pattern by just putting a little finger sensor or ear clip sensor on your earlobe, and you learn to manage this waxing and waning or speeding up and slowing down pattern of your heartbeat. And it's also a great tool for learning how to control depleting or negative big emotions and learning how to shift into more pleasant and enjoyable and renewing emotions. With repetition, with practice, you get very good at this as well and can learn to do this in the moment. And it's that combination of emotional shifting along with kicking in the parasympathetic nervous system response. So again, finding your window of tolerance and linking that to your emotional experience. So a couple of great technologies that are very, I would say, interactive and very user-friendly and a lot of fun, actually, because they do include game formats, so they make the practice of mind-body skills more enjoyable and doable. And then a final technology I want to mention for those that don't like the interactive component and they're busy, they're tired at the end of the day, they want to do something more passive. Another technology I will mention is called cranial electrotherapeutic stimulation, or CES. And what you do with this technology is literally just have a little unit that you purchase. You clip these little electrodes to your earlobes as such. You turn on the unit, and what it does is it passes an electrical current across your cranium. And in doing so, it entrains your brain to alpha wave activity. And so in alpha wave activity, it's kind of like you're in that meditative state. Your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and balances. So again, you achieve that beautiful window of tolerance, but a bit more passively. Your brain also releases some serotonin, which is one of your happy, calming chemicals. So I think either way you do it, more actively with biofeedback or more passively with something like CES, cranial electrotherapeutic stimulation, a few minutes a day. Either, I think, technology will help you a lot in finding ways to modulate those big emotions and get back to a more functional baseline, but in a way that's, I think, both cost and time efficient. All right.
Thank you, Tim. So I want to just highlight something a couple of things that Tim said. One, I think some people simply are not wired to do the standard mindfulness meditation. And so having a technology like the one you just described, the CES device, can really be a godsend. You don't have to do much, and it still can help get your brain into that, that nicer pattern. And really, what we're most concerned about is trying to get the right balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And so the other thing I wanted to just reinforce, because you talked about this over and over in different ways, and that is the importance of practice. very similar to what Jennifer was saying. So I want to bring us to a question. This is the first question, which really gets to the heart of this issue that we're talking about with these big emotional storms. And that is, what can you do in the heat of the moment? Because that's different than when you are in your own room and you're going over something that went poorly, or you're journaling or you're meditating or something like that. But here's the question. What do you do really quickly to get yourself out of a tsunami so you can think straight again? If, for example, you're dealing with a child who needs you to be present and tend to them, but you're stuck in some sort of emotional surge. So the reason the practice is so important is because we can't expect ourselves to deal with something like this effectively if we haven't kind of strengthened those muscles, so to speak, just the capacity to keep ourselves kind of balanced. I want to make a suggestion, though, of something that I think you could do in that very moment if you had practiced this just a little bit. There's another technique that Tim talks about a lot, and we really like it with natural mental health. It's called me moves, and it is geared towards kids, but it's a series of videos that give people these really simple movements. And so you just watch the video and you kind of mimic the video, but you could literally do something like just opening up your arms and chest and then bringing them back together. You could do that one time, and it would signal you to come back into the moment and back into your body. You might do something a little more complex, like, alternate sides and tap yourself on the shoulder or something like that. But, it's a way of getting yourself into the body, getting yourself out of your thinking mind so you can bring your brain back online a bit. Do either of you have anything to add about that?
Another thing that we've done with a lot of kids, and this is a takeoff of this company, HeartMath, that does a lot of the technologies around heart rate variability. But I love this technique where you put one hand over your heart, similar to what Jennifer talked about, but then you close your eyes and imagine that you're breathing in and out through your heart area while you think about a time or a place where you recall some very strong positive emotional experience. Could be a person you were with that you love, could be a beautiful place, like I always think about the mountains in Colorado. But I think what it does is distracts and shifts your frame of reference to something really powerful and positive, emotionally speaking, as you focus on this, narrow your focus of attention to this heart area in the body. Very effective as well.
So Jennifer, I'll toss a question toward you. This is talking about the difference between anxiety and anger. And would you think that the same techniques would work for both of those? They're quite a different emotional experience. Maybe you could give a little guidance about how to refine it a little bit.
Sure. And I think it does actually tie into what we were hearing about the me moves, right? That there could be some very, very simple movements that you could use in the moment to release some of that energy, whether it's anxiety or anger. Now, the movements themselves might be a little bit different. And also, as Tim was saying, we all come to it with slightly different set points. And so one person's level of anger might really require being addressed as anger. Someone else's anger, you might be able to address it, with the same standard technique that you've chosen to address your own anxiety. That's going to vary a little bit person to person. But there's one that we use in the resilience program called Shakeout Stress, and it works really well for anger. And you just shake it out, literally, like your body, and you can just do it with your hands. That might be enough if you have a child right in front of you who needs your attention. You've just shaken it out and you're right back to them. Or if you have more time, you might get more involved and you might shake more of your body, almost like you're doing the hokey pokey or something. You're shaking one leg and then you're shaking the other leg, and you're really just trying to discharge I think often anxiety is easier to take right into soothing. It still might need a little bit of just discharging, and sometimes that could be just a great big exhalation, just a loud sigh, right? Something that kind of releases the jaw. And also by focusing on the exhale first, then your inhale just follows naturally. So one thing a lot of people have heard that I try to undo, they've heard, well, I have to breathe deeply in order to calm down. But when you're already anxious, you don't have room to breathe deeply because you've been holding on. You're literally tight. And so instead I say, breathe it out first, and then be reassured that the inhale just happens. That part is effortless. All you have to do is remember to exhale. So there are also yoga poses that play on that, but do so for anger, something called lion's pose, where you do a great big exhale, you open your mouth wide, you stick your tongue out as you're doing it, and you just try to get everything out. So it's kind of fun, actually, which is one of the things I appreciate about Tim's mentioning the different technologies. I think even for people who are drawn to a more traditional meditation or mindfulness practice, it can be so helpful to remember to keep it light, try something new, make it fun. The more that we can, intersperse joy in these, the more readily we'll be able to access joy when these big emotional storms come up.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's really useful imagery that with anger, there's more energy that needs to be discharged. It's kind of going outward anyway. And so if you can find a way to more quickly get it out of your body, out of your system, that's really helpful. So I think we have time for one last question. And this is, what about solutions for those who seem to not necessarily be open to trying new things and seem to like being stressed out and resistant to change? It's not anybody that we know here in our lives, but it actually is probably worth saying that there is almost a little addictive quality to stress. At least for some people. I think I've been there myself, actually, where as soon as things kind of slow down, it's like, okay, I need more. I need something to, to keep my juices flowing or what have you. It actually can feel pretty hard when you've been really stressed for a long period of time and then suddenly that stress is gone. And your body can kind of have a letdown. So I do think it's true that there are those of us, maybe at one time in our lives, or some people do it repeatedly, that they're just kind of cooking up drama to continue to feel some kind of stress because it's somehow enlivening. So I don't think we can force people to be interested in these things or want to take on something new. If there's resistance, there's resistance, and I'd be interested in hearing what others have to say. But I think that taking resistance head on, where you're kind of butting heads or trying to force something to happen, seldom works. So you have to be a little more sophisticated about it. You have to find a way to almost be like a Tai Chi master and go with the energy that is the other person is directing. Any thoughts about that, others of you?
Yeah, I think Thich Nhat Hanh has a term called togetherness, which is about learning to live together in community and in a way that is helpful and loving to one another. And he really has focused on if we can't practice that for ourselves, we can't genuinely provide it for someone else. You'll hear my dog in the background, sorry. So I think the place to go with that might be to comfort yourself, to respond to your own reaction to the other person's attachment. You may very readily recognize that they have this attachment, or maybe you found it in yourself. Wow, I have this attachment to being stressed. And to meet that with kindness and compassion as you would like some challenge that you have to be met with, right? And in right now in particular, when we have these very strange situations, we're either with each other all the time, needing space if you live in a family and all in one house, or we're way too isolated and we can't see the people that we'd like to see as much as we want. Either way, the quality of our connection with one another has been really brought to the surface. It is really, really a place, an opportunity to practice right now. So it's I think, an opportunity to bring the attention back to yourself, actually.
Wonderful. Well, we are out of time tonight. We have one more of these sessions next week, same time, Wednesday at 7. It'll be our last one, and we're going to talk about heartfulness and hope. And we'll be joined by a dear friend of mine, Kaya Svian, who is just a delight. So please come, and thank you for being here, and enjoy the week between now and then. Remember, there's lots of things going on every day at naturalmentalhealth.com. Thank you.